So, have you ever made a New Year's resolution? Have you ever said to yourself, you know what, this is the year that I'm going to start taking my health seriously? This is the year that I'm going to get fit. This is the year that I'm going to join a gym and I'm going to start eating healthy. And at about January 15th, you find out that you have failed your resolution and you're no closer to getting healthy. Well, if that sounds like you and you want some tips on how you can keep your New Year's resolution, then this is the video for you, because I am Dr. Igor Yurichevich and this is Behavior Modification. Let's go. All right, so last time we talked about some antecedent-based tactics for self-management behaviors. These were things that you could do before a behavior occurred to increase the likelihood of desired behaviors occurring and decrease the likelihood of undesired behaviors occurring. Highly recommend, if you haven't watched that video, go check it out, link in the description. However, now we're going to talk about what happens after the behavior. So last time was before the behavior. Now it's what you can do after the behavior, and we're going to talk about those self-administered consequences. So Cooper, Heron, and Heward, they mention that these self-administered consequences, this is where you are arranging for specific consequences to follow occurrences or non-occurrences of one's behavior is a fundamental strategy of self-management. So importantly, we are talking about consequences now. So we are talking about reinforcement. We are talking about punishment. We are talking about what happens after the behavior occurs to change the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. And once again, we're talking about self-management. So these are techniques that are administered to oneself, or by somebody else. So importantly, these are self-administered consequences that follow one's own behavior. So you are applying consequences to the person in the mirror. You're applying consequences to yourself. Now, interestingly, under this definition, we include self-selected consequences that are delivered directly by yourself. So the person accesses the consequences themselves and applies them to themselves, or it can also be applied indirectly by another person that provides the consequences. However, the key distinction here is that these are self-selected consequences. So whether you apply the consequences to yourself or you enlist the aid of somebody else to apply those consequences, the key distinction is that these consequences are self-applied. They are applied to yourself, either by yourself or by another individual. So we're going to take a look at self-reinforcement, self-punishment, and both types of reinforcement and punishment, both positive and negative. So let's start off with the positive punishment. And before we get into that, I just want to mention that you will oftentimes read that these are self-management analogs of things like positive reinforcement, self-management analogs of things like negative punishment. And this is to distinguish it between administering the consequences to yourself and administering consequences to other people. You're going to find out that the structure of it is basically exactly the same, but they do find important, behavior analysts do find it important to make that distinction. So don't get confused. There's really no difference between it other than you are applying positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement to yourself rather than doing it to somebody else. So when you're applying it to yourself, they call it a self-management analog of whatever the consequence, whatever the contingency is that you are applying. So let's start off with that self-management analog of positive reinforcement. So let's say that you have a behavior that you want to increase. You want to increase your saving. You want to increase the behavior that you have where you save money for future purchases, but you're finding it difficult. So you want to increase the probability that you're going to save money in the future. One thing that you can do is you can positively reinforce the behavior of saving money. You can positively reinforce yourself for saving money. So for example, what you can do is you can say, all right, for every $50 that I save, I am going to put $5 into a fund. And these are things that I can spend on whatever. This is money I can spend on whatever, guilt-free. If I want to get myself a coffee or a treat, guilt-free, I can get it. And that's going to be my reward for saving $50. In this case, those $5 in your fund, they are added to your environment. So that's positive, makes the probability that you're going to save another $50 increase in the future. That's reinforcement. So giving yourself $5 to spend on whatever you want, if you save $50 and put that aside for responsible purchases, that's an example of the self-management analog of positive reinforcement. You can also have the self-management analog of negative reinforcement. So let's say that the behavior that you want to increase is tidying up. You want to increase the desired behavior of tidying up. So what you can say is you can make a commitment to do 50 sit-ups every night that you do not perform this tidying up behavior for at least 15 minutes. Now, this girl is way too psyched to be tidying up, so she doesn't need this negative reinforcement. But maybe you are not this enthused about tidying up. So what you can do is you can say, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 50 sit-ups. That is part of my environment. 50 sit-ups every night is part of my environment, part of my situation. But if I tidy up, I'm going to remove that situation. I'm going to remove those 50 sit-ups. And because of that removal, you increase the likelihood that you're going to tidy up the next night. So removing something, that is the negative aspect. Increasing the likelihood that you're going to do the target behavior of tidying up, that is the reinforcement aspect. So that is an example of negative reinforcement by taking away a behavior that you consider to be adverse, which is doing 50 sit-ups, which can be quite painful, will increase the likelihood that you are going to tidy up in the future, which is the target behavior. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is positive punishment. So let's say that you have a horrible habit of going around the city and just playing finger drums and touching every single unsanitary surface that you can find. So you're just running your hands up and down everything that you can possibly touch. And you say to yourself, you know what, that's an undesired behavior, touching all these unsanitary surfaces. I want to decrease that behavior. What you can do is, and this is a classic one, you can wear a rubber band on your wrist. And then every single time that you do the undesired behavior, you take that rubber band and you snap it. You snap it on your wrist. And in this case, you are adding pain. It's not a lot of pain, but it is an adverse stimulus. You are adding pain to your environment, to your situation, and that will make touching these unsanitary surfaces decrease in the future. So adding pain, that is the positive aspect of it. Decreasing the undesired behavior of touching the unhygienic surfaces, that is the punishment aspect of it. So that is an example of a self-management analog of positive punishment. And then lastly, to finish the circuit, we have self-management analogs of negative punishment. So you can also do negative punishment with self-management. And this is where you arrange for the loss of a reinforcer or loss of access to reinforcement for a time period based on the occurrence of a target behavior. So let's say that you are trying to decrease the amount of time that you spend on social media. What you might say to yourself is you might say, all right, if I spend 2 hours on social media, then I am going to take a timeout. I am going to remove my ability to access those reinforcers, and that is the negative aspect of it. And that's going to make my looking at social media lower in the future. So you take a timeout, you lose access to the reinforcers on your phone, and that lowers the amount that you are going to check social media later on. So the removal is negative, and then the lowering is the punishment, hence that negative punishment analog of the reinforcer. So those are the 4 analogs: positive punishment, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, that you can apply to those self-administered consequences to change your behaviors. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at recommendations for exactly how to do this, because there are a lot of things that can occur. There's a lot of problems that can be encountered, and there's a lot of problems that can be avoided. So let's start taking a look at some of those. So we got five recommendations for how to do this very effectively. And the first one, how to, self-punish, self-reinforce effectively. So the first one is to choose small, easy to deliver consequences. So both the rewards and the penalties that you use in your self-management programs, they should be small and they should be easily delivered. So a lot of people, when they're designing their self-management programs, they make the mistake of thinking that bigger consequences, grander consequences are going to be better. But in general, it is more effective to use small consequences that can be obtained immediately, they can be obtained frequently, and they're just easy to deliver. So for example, if you want to use positive reinforcement for a particular behavior, you might say to yourself, you know what, every time I clean up my room, I want to increase that target behavior of cleaning up my room. Every time I do it, I'm going to give myself a lollipop. Lollipops are small. Lollipops are easy to deliver. Lollipops can be obtained immediately. Like you can just, as soon as you're done, open that drawer, give yourself a lollipop, and you can do it frequently. You can give yourself 3 lollipops in a single day. You can buy bags of these for not very much. So it is easy, small, easy to deliver consequences, more likely to be effective as a reinforcer or as a consequence, for example, than a gourmet dinner. So a gourmet dinner might be worth a lot. You might like gourmet dinners way more than you like lollipops, but because they are so large, because they're not easy to deliver, because you can't do it immediately and frequently. So if you're going to go to a restaurant, it takes a long time. You got to make reservations. You got to drive there. If you're going to cook it yourself, I don't know what that soup and sauce was, but that's going to take much longer than a lollipop. So this would actually be an ineffective consequence. So our first tip is to select those small, easy to deliver consequences. All right, tip number 2, you want to set meaningful, but, and this is the key, easy to meet criterion for reinforcement. So they have to be meaningful, but they cannot be too difficult to meet. So what do we mean by meaningful? Well, meaningful means that the expectations, your criteria, is not so low that improvement of your current level of behavior is not necessary to obtain this self-administered reward. So you need to have a criterion for reinforcement that is higher than your current level of activity. So it's got to be meaningfully higher. It's got to be somewhat more than what you're currently doing in order to earn that reinforcement. But the second thing is to make it easy to meet. Do not make it too difficult, too high. And that is a very, very, very common mistake. And what happens is that if you put it too high, then you're unable to reach that level of performance and you basically go through extinction because you're never getting reinforced because you just can't make it that high rather than reinforcement. And the classic example of this are people trying to get into shape, trying to start an exercise program, and they just decide that they have never exercised in the last maybe 5, 6, 10 years. And they decide that what I'm going to do is I'm going to join a gym and I'm going to go 5 days a week and I'm going to go for an hour every single day. And I'm going to do a split body routine. So I'm going to do back and biceps on Mondays, chest and triceps on Tuesdays, legs on Wednesdays, legs and shoulders on Wednesdays. And I'm going to repeat the whole thing again. And I'm going to go in there for an hour and it's going to be great. No, it's not. You're going to quit. You have never worked out in the last 10 years and you are going for a criteria for reinforcement that is way too high. So you might say to yourself, you know what, if I work out, 5 days a week for 1 hour a day, doing all of those exercises, I'm going to reward myself, with a special night out, or I'm going to reward myself by binging my favorite show on the weekend. Spoiler alert, you are never going to earn that reinforcement because your criteria is just way too high. So what you want to do is you want to set meaningful levels that are slightly higher than your current level of performance and make sure that they are easy to meet, right? Make sure that you can actually earn those reinforcers. So criterion setting formulas, such as the one recommended by Heward, are great for making those determinations. So for example, you should, in this case, measure your baseline level of exercise. So over the last year, on average, how many days a week did you work out? And if the average was 0, that is your baseline level. 0 is the number of workouts per week that you're starting at. Take a look in the last year and what was your best week? What was the most you've ever worked out over the last year? How many times a week did you work out over the last year? And let's say that you went to, or physical activity, for example. And let's say that you went with your friends on a hike. You went camping one weekend and you guys did some hiking for those 2 days. That is your level of activity. You did 2 workouts in 1 week. In that case, your average baseline is no workouts per week. Your maximum during the year was 2 workouts per week. So your goal for the week has to be higher than 0, should be lower than 2. So you should probably say, you know what? I'm going to start with 1 workout a week. And if I work out for 1 day during this week, I'm going to reward myself with that night out. Or if I work out 1 day, I'm going to reward myself by allowing myself to binge watch a Netflix show on the weekend. Don't set your criteria too high. So it's higher than your average. It's higher than the 0, but it's not so high that you're not going to be able to reach that criterion and get that reinforcement. All right, tip number 3, you want to eliminate bootleg reinforcement. And what bootleg reinforcement is, this is one of the most common downfalls of self-management projects. This is basically where you give yourself the reinforcement without performing the behavior. So you basically circumvent or short circuit the contingency, and you do not perform the behavior, but you still give yourself the reinforcement. So this oftentimes occurs when you use everyday preferred activity and preferred treats as rewards in your self-management programs. Now, using everyday preferred activities and treats is tempting because they're oftentimes easy to obtain, they're easy to administer. After all, it is something that you do every single day. However, the downfall is that you are very likely to bootleg these reinforcers. So let's say that as a student, you're trying to save money, you're trying to cut down on your food expenses, and you eat Kraft Dinner every single day for lunch and dinner, right? So this is your Kraft lunch and this is your Kraft dinner. You're having Kraft Dinner every single day. If that's the case, it is highly unlikely that you will be able to use Kraft Dinner as a reinforcer. It is highly unlikely that you can say to yourself, okay, if I study 1 hour a night, if I read my textbook for 1 hour a night, I will reward myself with some Kraft Dinner. You eat this every day. You're going to have it regardless of whether you read their textbook for 1 hour or not. So if you want to increase the probability that you're going to read your textbook for an hour, do not use Kraft Dinner as your reinforcement. So what can you do? Well, one thing that you can do to combat this bootlegging trap is to not use that reinforcer as it is. Sorry, not use that everyday behavior or preferred activity or everyday treat by itself as a reinforcer, but use a special version of it as a reinforcer. So for example, if you have Kraft Dinner and you have it with ketchup, and this example comes from the Canadian Treasures, the Bare Naked Ladies, instead of just having Kraft Dinner with regular ketchup, you can have Kraft Dinner with fancy ketchups. You can have it with Dijon ketchup, right? So if you study for an hour, instead of having Kraft Dinner with that regular plain old ketchup, you can now have Kraft Dinner with that special Dijon ketchup. And that is going to make you less likely to bootleg that reinforcement, basically circumvent your contingency, because you're not missing out on your Kraft Dinner, the thing that you have every single day, but you're still getting reinforced by having that special ketchup with it when you do the behavior, your target behavior that you're trying to increase. And do yourselves a favor, look up Bare Naked Ladies. If I had $1 million, you're welcome. Dijon ketchups for the win. All right. Second last one. And this one takes a little bit of humbling, takes a little bit of humility, but we're trying to make use tactics that are effective. If needed, put someone else in control of delivering the consequences. You are still selecting the consequences. You are still the person that is determining what the consequences are. So this is still technically self-administered consequences. But what you're doing now is you're putting somebody else in charge as your performance manager. So this other person is going to make sure that these consequences are delivered. So if you say to them, you know what, you are in charge of giving me Kraft Dinner if I study for 1 hour, and you don't study for an hour, they are much more likely to say, you know what, I'm sorry, you're not getting Kraft Dinner tonight. Regular ketchup or Dijon ketchup, you did not earn your reinforcer. So they are much less likely to let you get away with not having that, or with bootlegging that reinforcer or circumventing the consequence, especially if your failure to earn a reinforcer reinforces them. So for example, if you put up $10 and you tell your manager, your performance manager, that if you do not study for 1 hour, those $10 go to them, they will for sure not give you that money unless you study for 10 hours. So again, putting somebody else in control of the consequences that you self-selected is another way to make these self-administered consequences more likely to be effective. Kind of seems like a cheat, but again, you chose the consequences. You're just having somebody else enforce them. It's still considered self-administered consequences. All right, and the last one, the last tip is to keep it simple. So one of the things that oftentimes happens when people start designing consequences and contingencies and self-administered tactics is they get very complicated with it, right? And it shouldn't be complicated. You should keep it as simple as possible. So if I study for an hour, then I get my Kraft Dinner with the special Dijon ketchup. That is a simple contingency. You can say, if I go to the gym for 3 days a week, I will earn 8 hours of binge watching Netflix on the weekend. You want to keep it simple. You want to keep it the least intrusive, most effective interventions that you can when you're doing these self-management programs. You don't want to make anything super complicated so that it is very difficult to figure out. Number one, have you met criterion, right? Number two, if it's very intrusive, if it's very difficult to deliver the consequences. So number one, the criterion should be clear. It should have those clear boundaries in terms of yes, I did, or no, I didn't. So you don't want things like, I'm going to work out hard this week. Very unclear boundary. You want, I'm going to the gym 3 times this week. You want the reward to be very unintrusive. So a lollipop that you give yourself, that's very small, very unintrusive. You can eat that anywhere. That gourmet meal, you can't. That's a very intrusive thing. And you want to make it as effective as possible. So choose high reward, high value reinforcers rather than low value reinforcers. But most importantly, just make it as simple as possible. So if I work out 3 days, I'm going to get reinforced with Netflix is great. If I work out 3 days and I stay on my diet, but I don't eat too many junk foods. However, if I do, I increase my cardio by 2 hours, then I will get to binge watch 8 hours of Netflix if and only if I'm able to complete all of my homework and study 2 hours per day. No, there's no way you're going to be able to apply that contingency. Too complicated. You want to keep it simple. All right, so that is it for what I wanted to cover today. So today we talked about the self-administered consequences, arranging those specific consequences that now follow occurrences or non-occurrences of one's behavior. And we took a look at the analogs for reinforcement, both positive and negative, and analogs of punishment, both positive and negative. And then we looked at those recommendations for self-administered consequences. So select those small, easy to deliver consequences. Set meaningful but easy to meet criterion for reinforcement. Eliminate those bootleg reinforcement. Get yourself some Dijon ketchup. And if necessary, put somebody else in control of delivering the consequences. It's still self-administered as long as you come up with the consequences yourself. And then finally, keep it simple. Don't make things complicated. Make things simple, easy to deliver, non-obtrusive, and yet still effective. And that's all that I wanted to talk about today. Next time, come back and we are going to talk about how to select and define these target behaviors that you can then use these self-administered consequences to either increase or decrease. But that is it for today. So come back next time. And until I see you again, stay frosty and stay functional.
If I had $1 million crafting. Of course we would. We just eat more. And buy really expensive ketchups with it.
That's right, all the fanciest Dijon ketchup.